Hello and welcome to Lesson 3 on Healing the Traumatised Brain. This course is designed to help you understand how the experience of trauma early in our lives can impact on brain development and psychological well-being, and learn how you can repair your brain and heal from such experiences. I hope you found the previous 2 lessons interesting and helpful in starting to understand more about how your brain develops during childhood and how it responds both to everyday stress as well as in response to adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. Now that we have this understanding, we're going to move on to thinking about what those around us can do to help heal our traumatised brains. We know from our previous lesson that the support from others can make a really significant difference to whether early trauma impacts in the long term or not, and it can mitigate against many of the changes we could see in our brain development. Before we think about the more practical side of this, we're going to return to what we learnt in our previous lesson about some of those behaviours, or what we might call trauma symptoms, that we might see as a result of changes that occur within our brains following exposure to trauma. These included hypervigilance, misperception of the world around us, and a greater propensity for emotional dysregulation. In this respect, we learnt about how neural pathways that have become sensitised to the fear response alter the baseline for arousal, so that we can end up overreacting to triggers that others would not find threatening, and also being taken outside of our window of tolerance. We learnt about how this can take us into hyperarousal, which manifests in the fight-flight response, whereby underlying high levels of anxiety and fear are often outwardly communicated as aggression, anxiety, control, or anger. When in this state, we may be hypersensitive to non-verbal cues such as eye contact or touch, and may read actions as threatening when not intended to be. Consumed with the need to monitor such cues for threat, our brain then becomes less able to interpret and respond to other cues, and also less able to enter a relaxed and calm state, bringing us back to the idea mentioned in our first lesson around it not just being what the brain does in response to trauma, but also what it cannot do. This can have the consequence of impacting on learning, for example, or can lead to being mislabeled as having concentration or attention difficulties as a result of the vigilance on our environment to ensure our safety. We also learnt about how triggers can take us into hypoarousal, where our brain enters a state of shutdown and our body freezes. In this state, we may feel disconnected or flat, and this is often communicated outwardly as being withdrawn, hard to reach, or unable to engage. We often refer to this as dissociation, the mental and emotional removal of ourselves from the traumatic situation. It allows us to pretend that what is happening is not real, and so as a management strategy can be very effective. In many ways, it's a very natural and understandable reaction and means of coping in order to protect us from difficult and often overwhelming feelings and experiences. However, with dissociation, there can be significant implications for both memory creation and retention, as when in this state, our brain is unable to process and integrate information and memories. This can impact on developing more adaptive ways of overcoming the trauma. Dissociation can also interfere in engagement with the world around us, whether this is work or school, our social lives, relationships, or even experiencing positive emotions such as happiness or pleasure. In addition to these states of emotional dysregulation, there are a range of other manifestations of trauma. These might include cognitive and attentional difficulties, disturbances in our sense of self or our identity, low self-esteem, risk-taking behaviours, relationship difficulties, organisational difficulties, impulse control difficulties, a lack of cause and effect thinking, an inability perhaps to recognise emotions in others or articulate our own emotions, and shame, amongst other things. Whilst these are common states and experiences for us to enter into in response to early life trauma, and we understand some of the neural mechanisms through which these can occur, we also know about the brain's plasticity and its capacity to change and rewire, thus creating opportunities for healing. This opportunity comes particularly during the adolescent years, as we know, but we also know that the brain doesn't fully reach maturity until our late 20s. So we have a really good window within which to encourage change and facilitate repair from this damage and its emotional, psychological, and behavioural consequences. In this context, we know that the brain is particularly amenable to change when exposed to repeated activation, as this facilitates new learning. If we are able to rewire and therefore heal the traumatised brain, we are essentially wanting to encourage growth and strengthening of new connections, as well as the discarding of those connections that promote overactivation of our fear or survival system. The best way we can support the brain to do this is through repetition, predictability, and consistency. This will offer the best chance of neural and psychological development to get back on a more typical trajectory so that our behaviour and our psychological well-being can reflect this. One key source of this comes from the support that others can provide to individuals who have experienced early life trauma. Through the relationships that can be offered, they can be supported to learn perhaps new ways of coping, perhaps learn how to reframe their understanding of themselves and the world around them, and perhaps learn how to reinterpret cues in such a way as to no longer see them as threatening. We might have to initially do this by finding ways of creating safety, both physical safety but also emotional safety for the individual concerned. It may need to be focused on reprogramming their nervous system through offering the attuned, sensitive and nurturing caregiving that they should have received as a young infant but perhaps didn't. This might include creating opportunities for them to learn that actually they are a good person, that they are lovable and they are deserving of good care, and that others can be responsive to their needs and can keep them safe. It may be through the provision of emotional co-regulation in order to support that individual to eventually learn to self-regulate. This includes being alongside the individual without judgment or evaluation, teaching and modelling regulation skills, and offering safe containment of overwhelming emotions they might be experiencing. This might also include helping to develop their emotional literacy to support them to understand about different emotions, what they're called, perhaps how they feel in the body. The notion of name it to tame it is often used when thinking about this. It may be through talking about the trauma and offering acceptance of the emotional experiences that it evokes, and understanding the behaviours that perhaps come from them, again without judgment. If the individual is still a child, this may include thinking about sharing and discussing information in an age-appropriate way, but also being as open and as honest as possible. Unpredictability and the unknown are likely to make children more anxious, more aggressive, more impulsive, and have more difficulties generally. Without factual information, we know that children tend to speculate and fantasise to fill the empty gaps in their knowledge in order to make a coherent story of their lives. In some cases, this can skew the reality, making it more scary than the truth. So honesty and openness will help the child to develop trust, and this will in turn support their recovery and will help them to learn that they were not responsible for their trauma. It may be through creating routine and structure to facilitate their understanding that the world and people within it can be predictable and safe. Within this, offering some degree of control to the individual may actually help them to feel safer, at least until such a time is reached where they trust that handing over control to others actually does still keep them safe. It may be through supporting an individual to engage in self-care, encouraging them to eat well, have good sleep and good nighttime routines, to engage in exercise, or to learn helpful techniques to manage their trauma symptoms. We'll look at some of these strategies and techniques in our final lesson of the course, but it may include teaching them about relaxation, for example, or mindfulness strategies, maybe about cognitive reframing or grounding techniques. It will also be important to check in with your own feelings about their experiences. Children in particular need to have trust in their supportive adult to be able to manage the feelings that they may have to give to them. But this can also be true of adults. Taking their lead on when to talk or not, and looking after yourself so that you feel strong enough to support them, will be really important. The idea that you can't pour from an empty cup is really, really important here. Hopefully this provides some ideas on how to get started supporting someone to heal from their traumatised brain. As mentioned, our final lesson will focus on strategies that the individual themselves can perhaps start to use. But this also may be helpful to those of you supporting someone with early life trauma, as often they may need the support and the encouragement from others to be reminded of those strategies. I hope you found this lesson useful, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.